I've been waiting for you.
And I for you.
Hold me close.
Forever, my love.
I love you.
1857, Mississippi. The screaming stopped before the smoke disappeared. Master Blackwood stood in the middle of the plantation yard, breathing heavily, while an old slave collapsed into the dirt at his feet. The man's crime, his shadow had crossed the master's boots. That was all. One shadow, one mistake, and now 42 slaves stood frozen under the burning southern sun, too terrified to blink. Nobody moved, nobody dared, because everyone on that plantation understood one brutal truth. Sometimes survival meant pretending you could not feel human anymore. The smell of burned flesh drifted through the yard while the overseer laughed under his breath. Children stared at the ground. Women held their breath. Men clenched their fists so tightly their nails cut into their palms. But nobody spoke, especially not Elijah, 16 years old, thin from labor, quiet by necessity, invisible by design. Elijah had spent most of his life mastering the art of disappearing. He never spoke first, never made eye contact, never let white people notice how intelligent he really was, because smart slaves did not live long. His father had learned that lesson the hard way. 3 years earlier, Elijah watched chains being wrapped around his father's wrists after a single argument with Master Blackwood. One sentence. That was all it took. The next morning, his father was loaded onto a wagon headed south. Nobody ever saw him again. Since that day, Elijah's mother repeated the same warning over and over like scripture. Silence keeps you breathing. And Elijah listened until the knock came. That night, long after the plantation settled into darkness, Elijah sat alone inside the tiny wooden cabin he shared with his mother. The room smelled like sweat, dust, and old wood baked under Mississippi heat. A weak candle flickered beside him while he dug a splinter from his palm using the tip of a rusted nail. Outside, insects hummed in the darkness. Then, knock, knock, knock. Elijah froze instantly, not because knocking was loud, but because nobody knocked on a slave's door, ever. White men kicked doors open. Overseers shouted from outside. Orders were given like commands to animals. But knocking meant acknowledging someone as human. And on plantations like Blackwood's, that was dangerous. Slowly, Elijah stood. Every instinct in his body screamed not to open the door. Nothing good ever came from the big house after dark. Nothing. He stepped closer, placed his hand on the latch, opened the door, and stopped breathing. Standing outside in the moonlight was Evelyn Blackwood, the master's wife. Perfect white dress, golden hair pinned neatly behind her head, a cloth bundle held tightly against her chest. But it wasn't her appearance that shocked Elijah most. It was her expression. She looked nervous. "I won't stay long," she whispered. Her voice was low and careful, like someone terrified of being overheard. Elijah said nothing. His eyes immediately scanned the darkness behind her. No lanterns, no horses, no overseers. Still, fear crawled down his spine. "I brought you something," she said softly. She held out the cloth bundle. Elijah didn't touch it. On plantations, gifts were traps more often than kindness. Finally, after several painful seconds, she spoke again. "May I come inside?" The question hit Elijah harder than a whip. May I? Nobody had ever asked him permission for anything in his entire life. Not once. Too stunned to answer properly, he stepped aside. Evelyn entered carefully, immediately filling the tiny cabin with the scent of perfume and fresh soap, smells that did not belong in slave quarters. She sat the bundle on the table and slowly unwrapped it. Bread, ham, cheese, real food, fresh enough that steam still rose faintly into the candlelight. Elijah stared silently, his stomach twisted painfully, but not from hunger, from confusion. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. Direct, sharp, dangerous. The woman looked startled by the bluntness of the question. Then strangely, she smiled. "Nothing," she whispered. Elijah almost laughed. "Nothing? Nobody crossed the plantation at midnight risking their reputation for nothing." He had seen too much of the world to believe that. You should leave, Elijah said quietly. Instead of leaving, Evelyn stepped closer. Then she said the words that changed everything forever. I want to teach you how to read. The entire room seemed to go silent, even the insects outside. Elijah stared at her like she had gone insane. Reading. A slave caught reading could be beaten half to death, sold south, lynched. White people feared educated slaves more than violent ones. Because violence hurt bodies, knowledge destroyed systems. That's illegal, Elijah whispered. Yes, you could go to prison. Yes, if your husband finds out, I know. Her voice shook slightly now. But she didn't back down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elijah asked the question that mattered most. Why me? Evelyn looked at him carefully before answering. Because I've watched you. Those words immediately tightened every muscle in Elijah's body. Watched him. She noticed the fear in his face and spoke quickly. I've seen the way you think, she explained softly. The way you solve problems before anyone tells you what to do. The way you repaired the wagon wheel last winter while grown men stood confused. Elijah remembered that wagon. He wished she didn't. Smart slaves attracted dangerous attention, and dangerous attention got people killed. You should forget whatever you think you see in me, Elijah said coldly. But Evelyn shook her head. I can't. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the Mississippi sky. Somewhere in the distance, dogs barked. Both of them instinctively went silent. Elijah noticed her hands trembling now, not dramatically, just enough to reveal how terrified she truly was. What happens if we're caught? He asked. Evelyn swallowed hard. You'll probably be sold south, she admitted quietly. And you? My husband will survive it. That answer surprised him because it was honest, painfully honest. For the first time that night, Elijah saw something real behind her eyes. Guilt. Not pity, not curiosity. Guilt, like she had spent years watching evil from inside a beautiful house and finally realized silence made her part of it. My father believed in silence too, Elijah said suddenly. Evelyn looked up. He spoke against your husband once. Her face changed immediately, and Elijah knew. She remembered. 3 days later, Elijah continued, they chained him to a wagon and sent him south. His voice remained calm, but the calmness felt worse than anger. My mother still wakes up listening for horses at night. Evelyn looked down at the floor, then quietly, I'm sorry. Elijah almost hated her for saying it. Sorry did not bring fathers home. Sorry did not erase scars. Sorry did not stop slavery. But before he could answer, another sound interrupted them. Footsteps outside, both froze instantly. Heavy boots crunching slowly across gravel. Closer, closer, closer. Evelyn's face lost all color. Elijah blew out the candle immediately, plunging the cabin into darkness. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. Neither of them breathed. Elijah could hear Evelyn trembling beside him. Then a shadow moved beneath the crack of the doorway. Someone was standing there, listening. Seconds stretched into eternity. Finally, the footsteps continued past the cabin and disappeared into the darkness. Only then did Evelyn breathe again, barely. We can't do this again, Elijah whispered. But even as he said it, he already knew that wasn't true, because something dangerous had already begun between them. Not romance, not trust, something far more explosive, hope. And hope inside a slave plantation was more dangerous than fire. Before leaving, Evelyn reached into her coat slowly. Elijah tensed immediately, but instead of a weapon, she pulled out a small worn book, a child's reading primer. She placed it carefully on the table between them. Then she looked directly into Elijah's eyes. For when you're ready, she whispered, and left. Elijah stood motionless long after the door closed. The tiny book sat on the table like dynamite, illegal, dangerous, powerful. Slowly he picked it up, ran his fingers across the cover, and for the first time in years allowed himself to imagine a world beyond Mississippi, a world where his name belonged to him, a world where nobody could sell his future. Outside, thunder cracked across the southern sky again, and somewhere inside the darkness of the plantation, the first spark of rebellion quietly came alive.